Today we talk about aspect ratios. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Tomorrow's Filmmakers. My name is Justice McCraney, and today we're going to be talking about aspect ratios. We're going to be talking about the history of aspect ratios, what they are, why they are important to know, and also how you can use them to tell a different message inside your film. So first off, what is an aspect ratio? Well, an aspect ratio is basically the frame size that you are shooting your film on. Have you ever noticed the black bars on the top and bottom of the screen? Or maybe on an older movie, the black bars on the left and right of the screen? That is called an aspect ratio. Now, the mathematical answer is that an aspect ratio is the proportion of the height and width of the image that you are seeing on the screen. But I'm sure a lot of you guys are wondering why. Why do some movies look like this, while some movies look like this? Or some movies have no black bars and look like this? Now, in Hollywood today, most movies are shot on either 185:1 aspect ratio or 235:1. But back in the day when everything was shot on film, most movies had an aspect ratio of 4:3. It was essentially 0.95 inches by 0.735 inches, resulting in a 4.3 aspect ratio. And that's why many of the older TVs look like boxes, because they had an aspect ratio of 4.3. So it was essentially shot kind of in a square so that it could be fit on the square film that was being fed into the cameras. So there was no widescreen, it was just kind of like a box that everything was being shot in. But since the world of cinema is constantly evolving and they are looking for ways to immerse the audience more, they sat down one day and they said, your eyes don't see in a box, your eyes see wide. How can we widen the image? So the first movie to ever come out in a wider aspect ratio was the movie Shane, which was created in 1953. Now, the way they did this was kind of just cutting off the top and bottom of the image to make it look widescreen. So it wasn't really true widescreen. They just kind of were testing it out. What if we make it look wider when it's actually not? So it wasn't the correct way to do widescreen, but everybody loved it. It was something new. It was something different. It was something more immersive. But they soon realized that cutting off the top and bottom of a film was just not going to work. So they started to look for ways to be able to print a widescreen image on the small square film that they are still using. And that is when the anamorphic lens was invented, which the technology is still used today. Now, I was planning on doing an entire episode on anamorphic lenses, but essentially what an anamorphic lens is it basically distorts the image so that it can be squeezed back to its original shape later. So on a 4:3 film image, the lens would make everything shot much taller and distorted, and that way it could still capture really wide shots. But once you shot it, the image would be stretched back to its original size, resulting in a very wide image that would still fit on a 4:3 film stock. And that is how widescreen was born. And the very first film to ever use this technology was The Robe that came out in the 1950s, and it was a huge success. And after that, the technology just kept growing and growing and growing. They took it to the extreme with Ben-Hur, which was shot in an incredibly wide 276:1. It's so wide that they don't even really use that aspect ratio today unless for a specific reason. But back in those days, it was incredible to be able to see so wide. We have the original 4:3 aspect ratio, which is a 1.33, the Academy ratio, Cinerama, CinemaScope, VistaVision, Super Panavision, Ben-Hur's MGM65, and then IMAX, which allows you to capture super wide and also super tall, resulting in an image that is so immersive and is the biggest screen you have ever seen. Now, in today's culture, the most cinematic aspect ratio is either 185:1, which shows almost the entire frame, or 235:1, which is widescreen and you can see really wide. But even after all of that, we always hear 16:9. 16:9 aspect ratio. I mean, that's the standard for TVs, computer monitors. I mean, where did that come from? How did 16:9 become the standard aspect ratio whenever all of these aspect ratios exist? Well, back in the day, movies started to come out in widescreen, and some movies would come out in kind of full screen. Well, if you didn't watch it at home with the correct TV, it wouldn't look right because it'd be the wrong aspect ratio. So they decided to create a format that sat somewhere in the middle so it would look good with both formats. So a 16:9 could play the 4.3 aspect ratio with the bars on the left and the right, and it could also play the really widescreen images with the bars on the top and the bottom. So the reason they made 16:9 the standard is because it could basically play every aspect ratio and still look good. And the funny thing is, 16:9 became the standard for everything after that. Widescreen DVDs are 16:9, 1920 by 1080 HD video, that's 16:9 format. Even a 4K UHD is 16:9 format. And that is the standard for all film and digital media. So whenever you pick up your camera, your cell phone, your video camera, whatever it is shooting in a 16:9 format. But again, many movies still use Panavision or 235:1 to not only capture more images on the side, but also to seem more cinematic because that is what we are used to in the movie theaters. So I just took you on a history of aspect ratios and how they came about, and if you thought it was boring, sorry, it's something you need to know. But what's really amazing is with the technology that we have nowadays, people are using aspect ratios in the black bars on the top and bottom or left and right to tell a story about their film. So if you haven't figured this out by now, every single aspect of filmmaking, no matter what it is, can be used to convey a message, even the size format that you are shooting your film in. For example, aspect ratios could make someone feel very claustrophobic and tight and not a lot of breathing room. Or it can make you feel massive and it's overwhelming and it's wonderful and just this grand, massive image. There's many different ways to convey a message with it. So there's a lot of directors out there today who will use aspect ratios to communicate a message. For example, A Ghost Story was shot in a boxy 4:3 aspect ratio to make our character feel trapped and very claustrophobic. Now what's also cool is they rounded the edges to make it look like an old Polaroid, so it just feels like the entire movie is just a memory. You're just watching a memory of somebody. First Reformed was shot in a 1:37:1 aspect ratio, which again gives the old time kind of feel. It makes you feel very claustrophobic. Quentin Tarantino made a very old Western movie called The Hateful Eight, but he shot the entire thing with a very old cinema camera and used the exact same aspect ratio that Ben-Hur used, a 275:1. Not only did this make you feel very cramped and claustrophobic in this one room where the movie takes place in, it also makes it feel very old, like an old movie that would come out in the 50s or 60s. So all of this was done purposefully to give a certain feeling or message to the audience. Or in Life of Pi, there's a few dream sequences where objects in the movie are interacting with the aspect ratios and going on top of them, and it gives almost like a jumping out of the screen kind of effect. So all of this is done purposefully just to communicate a message to the audience. So yes, you can use different aspect ratios to give a certain feel, but what is even more impressive is some directors change aspect ratios in the middle of the film to communicate a message. For example, the Grand Budapest Hotel jumps between 3 different time periods in the film: the 1930s, the 1960s, and the 1980s. And Wes Anderson communicates those time periods by the different aspect ratios. So anytime it's in the 1930s, it's a 4:3 aspect ratio with the black bars on the left and the right. In the 1960s, it's a different aspect ratio. In the 1980s, it's a 235:1 aspect ratio. So anytime you jump between these different time periods, you always know where you are because of the aspect ratio size. And there are some movies that change the aspect ratio very obviously. Like Oz the Great and Powerful, at the very beginning, it's a 4:3 aspect ratio, black and white, and then whenever he comes into the land of Oz and it's amazing, the screen slowly widens and it turns into color. So you start out with this very small frame, and by the end of it, whenever you're in the land of Oz, it just blows you away because not only does it turn to color, but the screen gets larger and you just feel how amazing it is. There was a movie that came out in 2014 called Mommy, and it was actually shot in a 1:1 aspect ratio, which is a very small box. So our main character feels small and insignificant and claustrophobic, and we feel the same way too. Well, in the film, the main character actually stretches the aspect ratio to a normal size. And whenever he does this, it feels like a breath of fresh air to not only the character, but also to the audience. We are feeling the same thing he is feeling by widening the aspect ratio. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World changes aspect ratios whenever there's a fight scene, and so on and so forth. There are tons of movies out there that change aspect ratios in the middle of filming to communicate a message to the audience. Now that's a very obvious way of changing aspect ratios, is just switching back and forth, but my favorite way that directors tend to use it is to use it very subtly so that you don't really see it, but your brain can see that something is happening and you start to feel a certain way. For example, in The Dark Knight Rises, Christopher Nolan shot in IMAX and in 235:1. So some shots have the black bars and some shots have no black bars because it's IMAX. Now, whenever Batman and Bane are about to have their very first fight, you see the black bars, it's widescreen, and then right whenever the gate closes, those bars are gone and it's IMAX. And it gives you the feeling of something massive is about to happen. They are about to fight, something bad is about to go down. So the aspect ratio changes, but it's not something that you notice, but your brain automatically starts thinking like, oh, this is serious, this is going to be something massive. In The Hunger Games: Catching Fire, it is shot in 235:1, which is normal widescreen. But everything that takes place in the battle is shot in IMAX. So whenever Katniss is about to go to the battle, it's 235:1, it's intimate, it's close, you feel claustrophobic, and then right whenever she's going up the tunnel to the battlefield, those bars slowly go away to where you are sitting there in the middle of the battlefield just seeing this massive, overwhelming event. So you're starting to feel exactly what Katniss is feeling, this overwhelming amount of just this massive battlefield. So it starts in 235:1. As she goes up into the battle, it switches to IMAX. And on top of that, you can be even more subtle than that. In the film It Comes at Night, it was shot entirely at 235:1. But whenever our character has a nightmare, all of those shots are in 275:1. So you automatically know when our character is having a nightmare because the aspect ratio changes and it's much wider screen. But during the final act of the film, when it comes to its terrible end, the aspect ratio slowly shrinks to a staggering 3:1 aspect ratio, which is a very, very small widescreen. It's so subtle you probably don't even notice it, but you can definitely feel it. This communicates to the audience that his reality has become his nightmare. Now, the director has never told you that, but he's shown you reality with 235:1, he has shown you a nightmare with 275:1, and at the end of the film, it's in the nightmare aspect ratio. So your brain automatically starts to think this is a nightmare. So as you can see, aspect ratio is very important to understand, and it can also communicate a message to the audience. Now, there are some directors out there that are not very good, and they just throw aspect ratios everywhere, and they have no idea what they're doing, and they do not care, and all it does is communicate just chaos to the audience. For example, one of my least favorite directors out there right now is Michael Bay. He's known for the Transformers movies. Some of them are okay, most of them are not good at all. But what is staggering to me is that in his newest film, Transformers: The Last Knight, he had 3 or 4 different cameras on set at all times with different aspect ratios. Because every single time the camera changes, the aspect ratio changes. Every single time. Even in dialogue scenes where there's just 2 people talking, whenever the cameras switch back and forth, it's different aspect ratios. There's IMAX, and there's 235:1, there's 185:1, there's this, there's that, and it is constantly changing. And Michael Bay has never commented on why he did this or why all these aspect ratios exist, which leads me to believe he just didn't care or he didn't really even notice it or think about it. So again, as you guys can see, aspect ratios are a very powerful tool and they are important to know what they are and why people shoot with different aspect ratios. And if you want to know more about filmmaking and videos like this, check out tomorrowsfilmmakers.com. We have over 40 hours of content and new episodes coming out every single week that you do not want to miss. Also, be sure to check out our completely free 1-hour webinar in the notes below on my proven method to become a professional videographer. It is a jam-packed 1-hour webinar that you do not want to miss. In the next episode, we're going to be talking about how you can use aspect ratios in your film, because there are proper ways to get different aspect ratios, and then there are improper, kind of quick ways to get different aspect ratios that can sometimes work and sometimes not work. So in the next episode, we're going to be talking about how you can use different aspect ratios to change the mood and feel of your film, and I will see you guys there.